an expert. Our presenter is Tom Grotenwohl, founder of Protect the Porkies. Thank you so much, Tom, for presenting this morning. Tom was part of a forum that we had in May of 2024, but so much has happened since then, and a lot is about to happen in the next month. So, Tom, thank you so much. And after Tom is done presenting, we'll have question and answers.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction, Joan, and it's great to see everybody again. I grew up going to a Unitarian Universal church, so I feel like I am amongst kindred spirits. I currently live over in Wakefield Township, north of Wakefield. I live very near to the Porcupine Mountains, very near to Lake Superior, very near to where all of this business is being proposed. If you want to find out more, you'll be able to find a lot of this information at protecttheporkies.com. You can also reach out to me at protecttheporkies@gmail.com. This is the website. And currently we are pushing for folks to go to our Take Action page because there is 50 million taxpayer dollars being proposed to fund the preliminary infrastructure, the power grid, cell towers, and road upgrades necessary for Copperwood to approach a construction decision. And that funding has already been approved by the House, but it still needs to be approved by the Senate. The Senate is likely not to approve it, which means that the House and the Senate will then need to sit down at the same table and negotiate whether it will be included in the finalized 2026 budget, which has to be approved by October 1st to avoid government shutdown. So this is a really great time to reach out to state representatives and lawmakers. Upper Peninsula lawmakers are pretty much lockstep in support of this funding. However, we've managed to block this funding twice in 2024 by finding allies amongst lawmakers downstate and by contacting the governor. So you might consider taking some notes in this presentation about what points resonate with you and what points you think might resonate with lawmakers to help us resist this funding for the third time. The proposed Copperwood Mine would be firmly in the center of 1842 treaty territory. The two closest Michigan tribes are Lockview Desert in Gogebic County, and of course Keweenaw Bay. Bad River and Red Cliff are also very close in Wisconsin. Since you showed that video of the water walk, we hosted a water walk last year, September 14th, the Gitche-Gaming Water Walk, and that was organized in collaboration with celebrated water protectors. There were members of 7 different tribes present and dozens of non-native allies. We carried water from the Montreal River at the Michigan-Wisconsin state line all the way to the shore of Lake Superior in the Presque Isle Scenic area of the state park. And we didn't get any beautiful TV coverage from TV6. The media was actually pretty tight-lipped on the event. It is, of course, a Native American ceremony. It's not a protest, but it was held in response to the proposition for the Copperwood Mine. And we got some good articles in MLive and other sources downstate, but the UP media was pretty tight-lipped on it. So we hope to have a repeat one day and maybe get some better coverage. The proposed mine would be right next door to the western section of Porcupine Mountain State Park. So the Porkies, to remind everyone, are mainland Michigan's largest remaining old-growth forest. That left image is eastern hemlock. And all of northern Wisconsin and western Upper Peninsula used to be hardwood hemlock forest. We don't hear about the hemlock as much because it wasn't as profitable as the pine tree. Back in the early logging days, if there was one pine tree in an acre, it would be defined as a pinery. Even if it was all hemlocks, if there was just one pine tree, it got defined according to the presence of that pine tree. But actually, eastern hemlock was the keystone species in the western Upper Peninsula. And the Porkies are the largest remaining old growth population in the entire country. So it's really a living museum. It's incredible that we have the state park here. And just a couple of years ago, it was ranked as the most beautiful state park in the entire country, according to an analysis of Yelp and TripAdvisor reviews. And the Porkies were set aside back in 1945 specifically out of concern for industrial interests, specifically logging, because hemlock trees, although not as valuable as white pine, they were used in the tanning industry based out of Milwaukee. It was basically one hemlock tree to tan one hide. So they would chop down the entire tree, strip the bark off. The bark contains all the tannins. And then usually the tree itself was not good for lumber, so it would just be left there once the bark was stripped. So the Porkies were set aside to make sure that did not happen in this area. Just to communicate how beautiful this place is, here are some photos that have been donated to us from Brian Mitchell. The fall colors are just starting to come in. I was out at the Lake of the Clouds overlook yesterday. This, of course, is from the Presque Isle Scenic Area over in the western end of the Porkies. You can see some of the characteristic black shale. That is Mainabujo Falls on the Presque Isle River. And so here you see what I consider to be the absurd location of this proposed copper sulfide mine. And for a lot of folks, the conversation ends with this map. You know, this area, most people would agree, is not a good place for a Walmart. It's not a good place for a gas station or a nuclear reactor or anything else. So why would we consider it for a foreign company's first ever mine, which would be shipping Michigan's copper out of country? You can see in this map, the black area is the permitted deposits, but the violet area is the deposit that has been leased to them, which they don't have the permits for, but they could potentially seek permits for. And that brighter green area is where the company says they plan to mine under the state park, to begin mining under the state park if they can get the permits. Many folks will say, well, we really don't need to worry about a mine because Michigan has very strict environmental regulations. So throughout this presentation, I want folks to be aware that everything we're talking about is in full compliance with regulations. So regulations will not stop a lot of really questionable things from happening. For example, mining underneath the state park would be in full compliance with permits. And there is a phenomenon called permit creep, which means once a company gets a permit to do something like mine underneath a small section of the state park, it then sets the precedent and makes it more reasonable to mine underneath more and more of the state park, potentially even underneath the Presque Isle River. This shows you the proximity of some of the mining infrastructure to the state park. The waste facility would be a mere 100 feet. One of their exhaust vents would be 150 feet from the state park. The North Country Trail, which is the longest of all national hiking trails, would also be very, very nearby. The North Country Trail is now part of the national park system, and it stretches nearly 5,000 miles from North Dakota to Vermont. Here you see that it is less than 500 feet from that tailings disposal facility. A TDF is actually just a glorified kind of jargon to disguise that this is a huge waste pile. We're talking 323 acres. That's 244 football fields. And we're going to talk about that quite a bit more. But other infrastructure, there are rerouted streams, sewage lagoons, ore stockpiles, explosive plants, and more that would be in that area. Of course, one of the key players is Gitchigami or Lake Superior, the largest, cleanest source of fresh water, surface fresh water on this continent. This is the mine's proposed deposits. And you see that dark red area is the highest grade copper, and it's closest to the lake. Although it's dark red, it's actually only 2% copper, and the overall ore grade is 1.45%. That's important because it means that almost 99% is waste, and we will return to that. But for now, the company's documents show that they plan to mine up to 100 feet from the state park. But if they can get the permits, they would be interested in mining beneath the lake. I'm sorry, I should have said 100 feet from the lake. And they're interested in mining beneath the lake as well, because that red area probably extends underneath the lake. So if they can get the permits, that's an example of permit creep. They would first say, we just want to mine 50 feet underneath the lake, and then 100, and then 200. So over on the east side of the park, this is the White Pine Mines tailings disposal facility. It is a tremendous waste pile that is visible from satellite imagery. And now we are proposing bookending America's most beautiful state park, Michigan's favorite state park, with two of these monumental waste piles. And Copperwood's waste facility, the company has acknowledged, would be visible from the Lake of the Clouds overlook, as well as from Copper Peak and the North Country Trail. They say they are going to be planting some bushes and other vegetation on top. So in time, they hope it will blend in with the landscape. But once you know it's there, people will know it's there forever. There's the Lake of the Clouds overlook. I was there just yesterday. So more than the aesthetic sort of disruption of seeing that waste from the overlook is its proximity to Lake Superior. As Joan mentioned, this would be the closest of these metallic sulfide waste facilities to Lake Superior in history, erected on downward sloping topography. And the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission has conducted a model showing that in the event of a dam rupture, mine waste over 10 meters in depth containing mercury, arsenic, cadmium, and lead would surge into Lake Superior in as fast as 21 minutes. They conducted 5 different models. In 4 of them, the waste went through the state park as well. And in 2 of them, it even went through the Presque Isle River, including the 3 waterfalls. And this sort of rupture would be so sudden, there would be really no way to alert anybody that it was happening. And it isn't really just a complete fantasy situation because Copperwood's tailings dam is designed to anticipate 100-year storm events. Seems reasonable considering that the mine would only run for 10.7 years. So they say, you know, let's plan for the worst case scenario in 100 years. However, there have been 2 1,000-year storm events in the Western UP in just the last decade. So these are some photos from 2016 from Gogebic County, where the mine would be located. That was a 1,000-year storm, which did a lot of damage to roads. And you may recall there was another 1,000-year storm that came through. I think it was the Father's Day flood of 2018, where Houghton County got hit particularly hard. Add that to the fact that the Association of State Dam Safety Officials says that Michigan's dam safety program is extremely understaffed to perform the mission of dam safety as mandated by legislation, rules, and best practice. That applies both to water dams and to tailings dams. And this is what it looks like when a tailings disposal facility ruptures. This was in Brazil in 2018, but that was in a state-of-the-art facility. And it ruptured 2 years after they had stopped storing waste there. And unfortunately, because that was in a populated area, that flood killed 272 people. Yeah, and we'll move on from there. But there have been high-profile ruptures. Oops, let me skip this part. There have been high-profile ruptures in the first world as well, the so-called first world, including Canada, British Columbia, the home of many of these new mining companies, and they have been in full compliance with permits. So again, the concern here is that if a rupture were to happen, the proximity of this waste facility to the continent's largest, cleanest source of surface fresh water is a real concern to be taken seriously. And this would be this company's first ever mine. They have never developed or operated a mine before. Even if the dam were to hold, and we certainly hope that it would, research is clear that copper sulfide mining is simply incompatible with clean water. This study looked at 14 copper sulfide mines responsible for 89% of US production. 100% of them experienced pipeline spills and other releases, and 92% resulted in significant water quality impacts. What did they all have in common? They were fully permitted operations in compliance with regulations. So unfortunately, contamination here is not the exception, it is the rule. Regulations do not stop contamination from happening. They only set the limits on how much we are able to complain about it. The mining company says that Copperwood would not cause acid mine drainage. Acid mine drainage is a specific kind of contamination where air and water interact with the sulfide in the ore to create acid mine drainage, in which sulfuric acid, which is the same as battery acid, steeps over the waste rock, kind of like hot water over coffee grounds. And that leads to the leaching of all of these heavy metals, which previously were safely contained in rock stored deep underground, but now it becomes water soluble and gets into streams and groundwater. As I said, Copperwood says they're at minimal risk of acid mine drainage, and they cite a study that they themselves commissioned, which was done by one guy named Mark over in Australia at a firm called Geochemica, who says their mission is to help projects advance. So it was very far from objective science. Meanwhile, this study looks at 9 mines exhibiting acid mine drainage and found that 8 out of 9 of them originally predicted low acid mine drainage potential, the same as Copperwood. Another concern, which is especially important now, is that before we even reach the construction phase, the mine will need cell towers, power grid expansion, and heavy industrial roads, the exact infrastructure that Michigan is currently considering funding with 50 million taxpayer dollars. So, to answer this question, if the mine complies with regulations, why worry? Well, in full compliance with regulations, which at the end of the day, permits are a bunch of paperwork, we would get to see over 500 acres of forest clear cut, the destruction of 62 acres of wetlands, streams forever rerouted. That has already happened, by the way. Water almost certainly to be contaminated, air, light, and noise pollution right next to Porcupine Mountains and the North Country Trail, mining underneath the state park potentially, the storage of over 30 million tons of waste in unprecedented proximity to Lake Superior, introduction of power grids, cell towers, and heavy industrial roads to shift the baseline and permanently open the area to ongoing development beyond the mine. So even though the mine will run for 10.7 years, that infrastructure like the power grid and cell towers and the industrial roads would risk opening the floodgates to other businesses that could really change the iconic wilderness character of that area forever, all in full compliance with permits. One of the big concerns there is because we're talking about the juncture of the Porcupine Mountains with the Black River and the North Country Trail. Even though the mine site would be on private property, it would be introducing significant habitat fragmentation. And when you fragment habitat, it really reduces the vitality of all surrounding regions. It creates more edge space, which is good for life forms like deer and rabbits and foxes, but really bad for creatures that need large tracts of uninterrupted forest, like bears, moose, wolves, any of the larger predators. Here is some footage of what the mine site looks like currently. And here you can see the proximity to Porcupine Mountain State Park. Literally a stone's throw down the road, that is the Copperwood entrance road, right next to the state park entrance sign. And I'll skip through some of the footage here. Here is where they are creating new wetlands, quote, wetlands, to compensate for the wetlands which have been destroyed. So as I said, they're permitted to destroy 62 acres. But to make up for it, they're creating 18 acres of new wetlands. Research is clear that, first of all, these new wetlands are currently not so wet. That is an original wetland you see to the right there. The new wetlands look quite different. Eventually, water and life will move back in because nature is resilient. But the studies are clear that invasive species are much more prominent in human-created wetlands than they are in naturally occurring wetlands. And here we see some of the streams which have been rerouted as well. So that's what the mine site looks like currently. Again, this map All of these activities are kind of standard operating procedure with mines, and we all use technology. We're using technology to communicate now. We all drive our cars, and our technology requires copper. But the question is, are there places which should be considered sacred and should be considered off limits? We use the metaphor that, of course, prisons as well are unpleasant. There's no great place for a prison, but our civilization does need them. However, we would never put a prison in the old town plaza, right next to a church, right next to a preschool. Similarly, our civilization requires mining. I wouldn't say that humans need mining because we have existed for hundreds of thousands of years without it, but technology needs mining. But to the extent that we have mines, should we consider placing one next to an old growth wilderness, a national hiking trail, and a worldly important source of surface fresh water? Many folks would say that if this is not an appropriate place for a Walmart, then why have a metallic sulfide mine? So to bring us up to date, last year, our campaign mobilized tens of thousands of folks to reach out to legislators to make sure that a proposed $50 million in funding did not go to the mining company, and the Michigan Senate halted that funding twice. First in July, and then again in December. A new grant was introduced on April 23rd of this year by Representative Markkanen. We caught them totally off guard last year. They really did not see our campaign coming, and they did some re-strategizing over the winter. So here are the differences. In the 2024 grants, it was $50 million for power grid, telecommunications, infrastructure, and road work in Wakefield Township. And the grant text mentions Copperwood or the mine 34 times. In Markkanen's request, introduced this year, it's for the same amount, for the same purpose, but with zero mentions of Copperwood or the mine. They are now trying to play this off as a community infrastructure grant for Wakefield Township. They are distancing the relationship to the mine now that it has become a very controversial topic. However, absolutely everybody knows that is the reason for the funding. Lawmakers are familiar with this. We've been trying to keep them educated on this topic, but it's interesting to note the strategy there. This was an article published in the Detroit News, coincidentally, or perhaps not, on April 23rd, the very same day that Markkanen's grant was introduced. And it is penned by prominent Upper Peninsula lawmakers, as you can see there. It says, America needs copper, and Copperwood is the solution. How many mentions of Lake Superior in that article? 0. How many mentions of the Porcupine Mountains? 0. How many mentions of the North Country Trail? 0. How many mentions of tribal nations? 0. So a highly disingenuous article. The Wakefield Township supervisor, Mandy Lake, has been going on a media blitz. She appeared in Lansing's most prominent political podcast. Again, 0 mentions of Lake Superior, the North Country Trail, Porcupine Mountains, or tribal nations. These folks are trying to talk about a mine like it exists in a void and does not have any neighbors. And that is what we really try to emphasize, is that our campaign is not really about mining. It's about the importance of this location and all of these incredible places which are of collective value to so many people. Interesting to note that Wakefield Township Supervisor Mandy Lake has signed a letter of support for the mine, stating also her direct involvement with an excavation company that has been contracted by the mining company. Her and her husband are the co-owners of Silver Creek Excavating and Trucking, which stands to earn a good deal of money should the mine reach the construction phase. And she is failing to mention that potential conflict of interest when she claims to speak on behalf of the community. So, copper. We're being told that we need it and that it is a critical mineral. However, it was actually denied an upgrade of status to critical mineral by the U.S. Geological Survey in 2023, which means that it is not at risk of undersupply. Just in the last couple of weeks, it was finally added to the USGS's draft list of critical minerals. However, there's an important nuance there, which is that the only critical mineral status has been awarded to refined copper, meaning copper that has passed through processing and smelting. whereas mined copper, raw copper, is still not a critical mineral. It's at a negative risk. What that means is that there could be an argument for more refineries in the United States, as ecologically unpleasant as that would be, but there is still absolutely no argument for new copper mines in the United States because there is no undersupply. So Copperwood's copper would be shipped out of country. This is the company's document. It would go to most likely to Canada, but potentially Asia or Europe. As far as the economic impacts, a job would only need to last for 6 months. A lot of these would be 6-month contract jobs going to specialized non-residents. They say that the project will revitalize the economy. The largest study ever done, which looked at 301 mines in the United States, found that only 29% were favorable economic outcomes for the community, and most of those came before 1982. So that study concludes there is surprisingly little evidence that mining will bring about economic good times and a good deal of evidence for expecting just the opposite. More recent research shows that the economic benefits in terms of income and employment, of course, you see a boost at the beginning of an operation, but in a number of years, the overall impact on the economy is negative, specifically due to impacts to outdoor recreation and the amenity economy. James Stock, a Harvard economist and former advisor to Obama, says in 89% of cases, copper mining ends up being a negative for jobs and a negative for incomes. A very important study, which if you're not familiar with, it is well worth looking into. It was commissioned by the Friends of the Land of Keweenaw, recently disbanded, back in May of 2013, called the Thomas Power Study. And some interesting graphs from this study. This one shows the price of copper and the value that copper would need to have in order for the proposed Copperwood mine to remain up and running. So this is the Copperwood mine has cited that they need a value of $2.50 per pound, but with inflation, that would be closer now to $4 per pound. And you can see all the times that copper has been lower than $4 per pound over the last century, which means that the Copperwood mine could potentially be booting up, closing down, booting up, closing down, laying off workers every step of the way. That's a phenomenon called flickering. You can see that at play in the White Pine mine. Here you see White Pine employment mapped against copper price. When copper price dropped, White Pine went from 3,000 workers all the way down to 300 workers. Then they rose to 1,000 and then went to 0. That phenomenon is called flickering. The good news is that even though mines like White Pine have laid off over thousands of workers, local-oriented jobs in the Western Upper Peninsula have been increasing. So jobs that just local people create, which do not export the wealth out of the state, are increasing, whereas export jobs are decreasing. And overall, the Western Upper Peninsula's income per person is increasing almost on par with the national average and faster than the rest of Michigan. So these mining companies say that we need them to come in and save the economy, but actually the economy is doing much better now that the Western UP is not as dependent on the boom and bust cycle. So I'm going to wrap up here. One of my favorite quotes from Henry David Thoreau, which I think is very insightful because he wrote this over 170 years ago. So just consider how must people be feeling today. He compares nature to a poem. He says, "Is it not a maimed and imperfect nature I am conversing with? I take infinite pains to know that all the phenomena of the spring, thinking that I have here the entire poem, and then to my chagrin, I hear that it is an imperfect copy, that my ancestors have torn out many of the first leaves and grandest passages and mutilated it in many places. I should not like to think that some demigod had come before me and picked out some of the best stars. I wish to know an entire heaven and an entire earth." So what the Porcupine Mountains represent is a place that we can still go to have an entire heaven and an entire earth, to see the stars, to walk in old growth forest, having a an operating mine with all of the 24-hour lighting and noise right next door is antithetical to the spirit of this place. What is the current status of the $50 million earmark to Wakefield Township for Copperwood Mine infrastructure? So as I said, it's been approved by the House. It will not be in the Senate's budget. They will now sit down at the same table and negotiate back and forth. We are encouraging everybody to reach out to both your senators and representatives, but also some other top targets from downstate. Unfortunately, UP lawmakers are not going to change their tune on this one. Our best chance is to find allies among downstate lawmakers and to reach out to the governor. I was just down in Lansing on Wednesday of this week. We held a rally at the Capitol. There were around 200 people in attendance, including folks from the Upper Peninsula, from Wakefield, from Bessemer, from Ironwood, and loads of people from downstate. It was a really good turnout. A lot of people made their own signs. And eventually, we even got to go inside the Capitol building in full compliance with security, of course. It was a very peaceful entrance, but we let the lawmakers know how we feel, and then we made our leave. So you can reach out to me at protecttheporkies@gmail.com. You can go to the website, and if you go to the Take Action section, it'll give you a list of action targets. And we're looking to include language something along these lines. You can find this on the website. Please exclude the $50 million earmark to Wakefield Township for Copperwood Mine infrastructure from the 2026 budget. Do not use this item as a bargaining token. So that line is there because we need the House to drop it from the budget, whereas the Senate, we've heard from lawmakers that it's going to be an $80 billion budget. So they are not potentially going to reject the entire budget just for a $50 million earmark. But we need to make it clear, as the next sentence states, that there is nothing more critical than the integrity of Michigan's most beloved old growth park and the continent's largest and cleanest source of surface fresh water. Tell them your vote is on the line, or if they do not represent you, find a way to communicate the importance of this issue. They've got so many issues on their desk, so many votes on their desk, that it's easy for this one to get lost in the noise. But we really are dealing with some resources of value, not just to Michigan, but to the entire country and the entire world. So that concludes my PowerPoint, but I do want to go to protecttheporkies.com real quickly. You'll find right on the homepage here, action steps for everyone. You can click that. It'll kind of give you a recap of why this project is terrible, in my humble opinion. And then some of the language to be used and some easy steps you can take. So first of all, reaching out to the governor. She ultimately decides if the budget will be approved. She does have line item veto power, but she very, very rarely has exercised that. So our best bet is to make sure that she knows this is a wildly unpopular proposal. Reach out to state and senators and representatives. Even though the House has approved it, we really need to pressure the House because they are the ones who may be willing to drop it. And then at the bottom here, these are our top targets. We're now focusing on the House because the Senate is on our side. So we really need to concentrate on letting the House know that this is unpopular. You can simply copy and paste all of those email addresses at once. You can reach out to them via phone, and you can find some important language and an example script to use. So finally, repeat those steps every day. You can save a copy of your message and copy and paste, and you can share this action with all of your friends and family and anybody else in the network. October 1st is the deadline, but really this week, this coming week is going to be key. The most important conversations are underway. October 1st, even September 25th, that's already getting too late. So we really want to keep pushing as hard as we possibly can. So thank you so much for your time. Please reach out to protecttheporkies@gmail.com, and I'm happy to take any questions.